everyone, and welcome back. We are continuing on with all of the things that I'm going to need for my upcoming trip, as well as continuing down the path towards me becoming a supervillain. And one of the very necessary items for both of these things, gloves. It is an accessory that is absolutely necessary in the 1920s still, and as of the early 1900s, it was considered a necessary thing when you were committing crimes because fingerprints were discovered. So, all around, a useful item. But in researching gloves of around 1920, I started questioning a lot of things. For one, I don't really know glove etiquette. I don't know when I'm supposed to put them on, take them off, when do you wear them, what do you wear them with, are there rules and regulations about what colors or styles you wear with certain outfits? I am completely unaware of the basics of glove etiquette. I also started to question why we stopped wearing gloves. I can take some pretty good guesses at, but obviously at some point we went from gloves being a regular part of everyday attire to not. And I mean, gloves were a huge part of clothing for a very long time. Gloves are ancient. They can be found around the world because as humans, we gotta deal with keeping these things safe and warm. And that is an around the world, no matter where you are, problem, whether it's the weather or safety from the job that you were doing, protection from heat or fire or abrasion, or keeping your hands clean, or just simply fashion, accessorizing an outfit and showing off a little bit more. The thing, of course, that defines gloves is the fact that you have full coverage on every single finger individually rather than covering the entire hand like a mitten or exposing all of it like a mitt or a fingerless glove. So there are a few specific issues with that, because in order to cover each digit individually and still have dexterity, they need to be somewhat tightly fitted to the hand, which means that they need to be somewhat stretchy. And though spandex is certainly an option nowadays, it was not in the past. So that is one of the reasons why gloves are typically made out of leather, more so than any other option historically, because it stretches all of the ways. It's not just stretch in one direction or even in two directions, it stretches every direction and can mold to the shape of your hand. So you can have a fairly tight fit pair of gloves, but still be able to actually do things with your hands. So it makes sense why leather has historically been the popular option, though there were plenty of other choices. Knit gloves or any other technique that uses loops or knots instead, also definitely an option for making gloves. I just haven't seen as many of them historically as leather options. Part of this is probably due to the fact that they're going to deteriorate more, but they also are not going to offer quite the same level of protection and warmth that leather gloves can. And inevitably, some of these options don't stretch quite as well, at least not in all directions. You definitely do find knit gloves, usually of cotton or silk, in the 19th century. More often than not, they seem to be referenced as a more casual item when it comes to fashionable choices, something that's worn with a daytime summer dress, for example. It's lighter weight, it's better for warm weather, and so it makes sense there. You will also, of course, see the standard white knit cotton glove being regularly used for those who are dealing with serving, such as serving food in restaurants or working in households where they constantly want to show that their hands are pristinely clean, so they have perfect white gloves for every single part of the process. So there are definitely times you're going to see fiber-based gloves, whether it's wool and linen or silk and cotton, they're around. I did, interestingly enough, find that there was a sort of fashionable explosion of knit silk, in particular gloves, in the late 19-teens, purely because leather was getting harder and harder to find because of World War I. Not only were we low on the animals, but we were also low on the people to take care of the animals, and the entire manufacturing process was pretty disrupted. Leather had to go to things like shoes that were absolutely necessary rather than fashionable things like day gloves. So knit gloves became more popular during that time, and it seems dependent on what region you're in as to what sort of textile you're finding for non-leather options. This is not a surprising idea. If you've watched any of my Textile 101 series, you'll know that a lot of these fibers make it around the world really fast. They end up getting used anywhere and everywhere that they can because they all have wonderful different attributes. Linen is particularly great at dealing with hot weather and keeping you cool. Wool is particularly great at dealing with any sort of moisture, so forth and so on. So it is really essential to know when you're dealing with different fibers what you're trying to achieve with your final product. And this importance of fibers and how they are utilized is one of the reasons why I'm so very excited that the sponsor of the video this week is Brooklinen. I've actually been purchasing my bedding from Brooklinen for 7 years, and right now they are offering you guys $20 off of any purchase over $100 if you just click the link below and use the discount code Rudolph. I first came across Brooklinen when I was looking for luxury quality bedding and was only finding luxury pricing. Turns out what Brooklinen does is manufacture all of the goods themselves, so that way they're able to offer them directly to you without a middleman, so you get amazing quality goods without having to pay the luxury price tag. And you know how much emphasis I place on good quality textiles, not only in my clothing, but obviously in my bedding. So this time around I ended up with their linen bedding. It helps regulate your temperature no matter what the weather is. It deals with moisture so well. It just makes perfect sense for bedding, and it was such a comfortable sleep. I ended up with the hardcore bundle, which has the sheets, the duvet cover, and an extra set of pillowcases, and you can mix and match colors and designs for all of them. There's so many choices to pick from. And again, right now they are offering you guys $20 off of any purchase over $100 if you just click the link below and use the discount code Rudolph. I absolutely adore my Brooklinen sheets. I've slept on them for 7 years, and they really are the best sheets that I have ever slept on. And thanks again to Brooklinen for sponsoring this week's video and allowing me to wax poetically about linen for a little bit longer. But next we need to wax poetically about gloves. That's right. I love these things, and I really wish we'd bring them back into daily usage. I wish they were more typical and hadn't gone out of style like they had. Yes, we still have gloves for safety purposes and for weather, but honestly, one of the main reasons that gloves were popular throughout history was because it keeps your hands clean. Which is why glove etiquette can seem a little convoluted when you first look at it. Most of it revolves around keeping your hands clean and not fidgeting with your gloves at inopportune times. Basically, not drawing attention to yourself in any circumstances when you're not supposed to be. So the general rules for gloves, when you wear your gloves and when you don't, first off, are more like guidelines and rules, and they do very explicitly state this, that gloves, and when they're worn, is going to be situational. But the general rule, the easy thing to keep in mind that I came across was, if your hands are idle, you're wearing gloves. If your hands are busy and occupied, you are not. Which makes perfect sense. If you are out walking around, hands aren't doing anything particular. If you are sitting in someone's parlor and speaking to them in a more formal situation, not casually hanging out with your friends, but just sitting and talking, your hands aren't doing anything. But if you are sitting down at the dinner table, you remove your gloves before you eat. If you are at a party and you are dancing, you keep your gloves on because then you aren't touching everybody's hands. But the moment you go over to, say, get something to eat in between, remove your gloves. The other rule that I came across was, is it more distracting that you are continuing to wear your gloves than the process of taking them off, or vice versa? So the whole thing seemed to be wrapped up in don't draw attention to yourself. If you're wearing gloves and no one else is, that's a problem. If you were removing your gloves and no one else is, that's the problem. But the idea of wearing gloves inside and making that normal would be kind of nice just to keep your hands clean, because that makes perfect sense as you're going about, touching things, handling things in your day. Then you go to sit down and eat. You don't necessarily have to go wash your hands if they've been safely inside of gloves the whole time. Same thing goes when you're going and dancing and touching a whole bunch of people's hands. Everyone's just touching gloves, and it's understood that your clean hands are staying nice and safe inside. So I like this idea a lot, and of course it's great and wonderful and fashionable, and I just really like the accents of it. The gloves of the 1920s that I was researching in particular were just glorious. There's so many unusual shapes and styles, the gauntlet shapes and puffs and cut work and all sorts of inlays and lace, and just they just get really interesting for a little while there. Very experimental, which makes perfect sense if you're in an era where, say, post-World War I, you're still dealing with limited resources. A great way to change up your outfit, gloves. I have a feeling that's why gloves continue to be popular throughout the 1930s and 1940s, because Great Depression, war, all of those things, it's something that's relatively inexpensive to keep updating. So it's no wonder gloves went through some major periods of popularity. And it's not just always really popular. There are definitely eras where it was less so and more so, and this is a regional thing. There are certain times apparently where everyone in Paris is wearing gloves, but no one in Italy is. you're going to find a variety of options depending on the era. As for the eventual just death of gloves as a fashionable item, that not surprisingly starts off in the 1960s, really ends up solidifying in the 1970s as more and more people turn to casual clothing. A pair of what seemingly are formal gloves worn with a pair of jeans and a sweater going to the supermarket just doesn't really quite mesh. So understandably they got left off except for really high fashion stuff, more formal occasions, dinners and dances, as well as more sporty events and things like that. So gloves became either a statement of fashion or formality. In fact, my honestly earliest memory of clothing comes from when I was probably 4 years old or so, and I went to a naval ball in a fancy little dress. I don't remember the dress exactly, I just remember that it was puffy. I had on patent leather Mary Janes, and I had on a pair of lacy white gloves because it was the late 80s and that's what you did as a child. And I thought I was the fanciest thing ever. Maybe this is the birth of my interest in fashion, but the point is, those gloves, to me, long before I had a larger understanding of the world in general or formality or fashion, those gloves meant something special. They meant something formal. And that's what gloves were essentially relegated to and gradually have even disappeared from that. They're not that common aside from the absolute most formal of situations now. But in terms of fashionable gloves, this is my petition to start bringing them back, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you how I pattern out a pair of gloves to match my hands, because not everybody has hands that fit into the standard glove patterns, no different than clothing. Everyone has dramatically different shapes and sizes and proportions of hands. And even if you do fit into regular gloves, finding the style that you want is pretty limited nowadays. So we're going to work on the pattern and we're going to work on some of the different construction methods, because depending on the era that we're talking about, it can be a pretty dramatically different pattern and construction method. But interestingly enough, the way that gloves were sewn in, say, the 17th century, you will still find gloves being sewn that way into the 20th century. So there are definitely consistencies across the board, because there's only so many ways that you can deal with something that is that small and in reality pretty simple for all of the weird little pieces that we're going to have to cover. So this is 3 gloves that I have from different eras. This is my 1840s repro that I made for Gonzo. This is a vintage pair probably from the 1960s or so, and this pair is a more modern pair that I purchased from Italy. So there are going to be some stylistic differences between all 3 that we're going to go over. The first pair we have here is my 1840s pair. The main body I've seen often called a trank, though the early references I saw were referring to the cut out portion before it's actually been made up as the trank. So I'm not sure if it continues to be actually called that historically or if that's a modern adaptation. Of course, we have the separate thumb here. In this era, it tends to be a very wide and shallow thumb shape, kind of a oval, and this point here is what allows you to be able to move. So it's just one thumb piece with this little extension here. These pieces here are called forks or fourchettes. There's some variations on the term as well, and historically, the patterns that I'm usually basing off of for 18th century don't have a separation here as often, though occasionally they do. And then we have the 3 points on the back of the hand. I chose to do these by way of chain stitching, but there are lots of different methods depending on the era that you're looking at. You can see this is a shorter style of glove, so I don't have to deal with the wrist being a little bit loose. Longer styles of early eras end up making the wrist just big enough for you to fit your hand through. They don't have any openings, buttons, or snaps to deal with that like later eras. This 1960s example, as you can see, has a dramatically different thumb shape. It's much longer down here, and it has a really weird and complex shape that we'll be getting into later, because that seems to be really popular in the 1920s already. The thumb also curves over the top rather than coming to a point, and you'll also notice that these forks are not only split in the middle, but they have a little extra piece. And this tiny little piece here I've seen called a gusset or a quirk. In the vintage manual I was looking at, they specifically stated that when you add a little gusset here, it is called a quirk, but they called these gussets. It seems on more modern gloves, though, they also call these tiny little bits here quirks. And that's just to deal with that little bit of tendon and skin in the part of your hand that you have to get over. There's a little split here as well to help deal with getting the hand in a little bit easier while still keeping the wrist fairly snug, but it doesn't extend very far, so you don't have to deal with buttons or snaps in order to keep that tight. The final example is one of my more modern gloves that I've purchased, and it has the same weird shape around the thumb that the 1960s example does. It does not, however, have those little gussets and forks there. It's a bit simpler in its design. Really interesting contrasts on the fingers there. The split for this one is on top, and it's simply piped along that edge, which is really common in lots of different eras. This glove too is lined in a silk knit. That's really common for high quality gloves still to this day. So not terribly different than the vintage examples, but pretty different than that 1840s. You might have also noticed that there's 3 different methods for sewing things up here. You can see a hand stitch method of whipping over the edges. This example has the seams lapped and stitched. You have to have a very specific machine for that. And this example has the seams done up right side, inside out, and then turned right side out. And there are plenty of other vintage examples that I found where this stitching, which is an overlock stitch, is visible on the exterior instead of turning it to the interior. So you can do it either way. There are loads of different 1920s styles, and since I couldn't really decide what I wanted, I went through and found a bunch of advertisements and originals and then sketched them out to compare. I ended up deciding on this particular example of a gauntlet glove, which I really liked the contrast on, but I'm definitely going to be going back and making more of these because I love all of them. To pattern out gloves, you essentially start off by taking a hand tracing, or as I continuously keep calling it, a hand turkey, because, well, I live in America. And all of the measurements that I like to take in order to know what the size of your hand is and the size of your fingers, I like to work in millimeters just because it makes more sense to my brain with those tiny numbers rather than dealing with fractions. But interestingly enough, your glove size is taken by measuring around the joints of your fingers and seeing what that comes out to. The difference being that you aren't measuring in regular modern inches, you're measuring in French inches. It's 9.5 French inches to a modern 10 inch. So what we end up with is that though my measurement comes out to about 7.25, I am a size 7 in gloves because that's what I would be in French inches. So fun historical fact of the day, an antiquated system that we still use. I'm not going to walk through the entire process of taking this handprint to a glove here. I am linking the video where I'm doing that above because it is lengthy, tedious, and if you really want to watch it for instructional purposes, great. Otherwise, it's really boring. So we're going from this to all of these different parts. This is the trank, the main thing that we're going to be cutting our body out of. This is sort of the fold line there, so it won't be 2 separate pieces, it will be one, but all of the markings that I've got on this will transfer to one side or the other in order to get it correct. I also have a gusset for down here because we are doing the 1920s gauntlet style, which means that it's super flared and wide after the wrist. I do have a little strap that I'm going to cut that will help pull in the wrist tighter to accentuate that. And our very weirdly shaped thumb, which it's still throwing me. I've only ever done really old styles of gloves, so this is a very weird and new shape for a thumb hole and thumb shape. So that'll be an interesting experiment. We have our little fork shape as well. Those will be cut down to be the right length for each one of the fingers. And I will also cut out tiny little gussets or quirks for the fingers, but those just be way too small of a pattern. I also have this piece that's going to go down at the bottom of the glove as a contrast. I've got some decorative pieces as well that I need to cut out in order to create the style that I'm looking for. So let's get to cutting. I'm going to be doing black and white for my contrasting because most of the references I found in the 1920s say that you should do black or white gloves. Occasionally gray is in style, or brown, or navy, but apparently brightly colored gloves were considered rather tacky around 1920, so we're sticking with the classics for right now. I'm tracing everything out on the different pieces of leather, laying them out in the areas that are going to be the strongest or the stretchiest depending on what they need, and I'll start cutting everything out. Generally recommend a pair of shears for this rather than dealing with a knife because it's such a thin leather. And I'm not cutting every single bit out yet. I'm just dealing with the major parts. I'm not going back in and cutting apart the fingers or rounding those off, just making sure I have all of the pieces that I need to get started, including all of the little appliques and accessories that I'm going to need. So here are all the different parts when I lay them out before we actually get into stitching them all together. I am starting with the applique pieces. I am using a little bit of a double-sided sticky tape that is meant for leather. It's the same stuff that I use for shoes. This is just holding those tiny little appliques into place because the white leather I found is really stretchy and it will grow and move as I try and machine stitch over it. So a little bit of extra reinforcement isn't a terrible thing. I did for some reason choose to do contrast stitching over these appliques, which I only slightly regret because you can see all of the mistakes, but it turned out okay. Next, I need to do the points over the top of the hand. I'm using a double needle for this, which seems to be pretty common. It ends up with 2 lines of stitching on top and 1 line on the bottom from your bobbin. That means that they'll be perfectly parallel. I have double needles in a few different sizes, so this is something I definitely recommend if you want to be doing glove work. In order to finish it off, rather than back stitching, we just pull all the threads through to the inside and knot them off together. And you end up with clean, precise, measured lines for your points. There's lots of ways to do these, I just went with the simple option. I then can move on to doing the gusset. This is what's going to give the glove its gauntlet shape, so this just gets top stitched in, really simple construction. Then we move on to the strap. This, I wasn't exactly sure what the length was or how I was going to attach it to begin with, but I knew that I was going to need a strap about this width, and then I was going to be adding a snap with the pearlescent top to it. I've got a few vintage ones that have been laying around forever that I have never found a purpose for, and that means, of course, that I don't actually have a press for them, so I had to go in with a pair of pliers to work the points together. But this is going to hold the wrist more tightly around my hand. I figured that I would need a long strap going from the outside that needs to be put into a little slit, and then the underside of the snap is going to attach on a small piece at the seam. There are definitely different ways that I've seen this done. There are straps that go the entire way around the wrist, or gloves that use elastic instead. So there's lots of options for drawing the wrist in to fit better. This is just the one that I seem to find pretty commonly with the large gusset. Next we get to all the little fiddly bits like the thumb. I am choosing to do all of my seams facing outwards rather than flipping them to the interior. This is a stylistic choice, which means that I need to find a way to bury that knot and the extra tails that I made, and I'm just simply putting a needle through and pulling it to the inside. So now that we have the thumb ready to go, it's time to attach it. This is where things got interesting. I usually do this by hand, and well, it's a bit of a mess by machine because they have special machines for it that I don't have. So they usually overlap body over the thumb and then top stitch in 2 lines. The first time I did it, I taped everything into place and started stitching around once, got to the point at the thumb and it got really difficult, but persevered, made it through, squished it around enough, didn't stitch through anything I wasn't supposed to, and then went back and did a second line of stitching, which was even more difficult to do. The next time around, I learned something, which was to start at the very tip-top point and to use a double needle. So you only have to go around it 1 time rather than twice. By starting at the tip-top point, and I just simply put markings to match up rather than taping it together, you can get in there. And as you come back up to that final point at the end, you turn the thumb inside out and stitch into the thumb. And wow, that made it a lot easier. I didn't do it perfectly, but I think I could do it way better the next time. Then it's time to move on to those forks and quirks. I am stitching the forks with the seam towards the inside and then lapping it over and stitching the quirks that way. Now comes the time that you need to cut apart all of those fingers and actually round off the tips. It's just better to avoid doing this until now because they can kind of get in the way and are much more likely to accidentally get stitched through. Starting to stitch on the forks, we start from the upper side and stitch each one of the forks on individually. They will be too long for some of the fingers, but we will take care of that in a minute. It's easier, in my opinion, to shape it out to the right length than to try and measure and guess and check and all of those things. Leather stretches, it's so hard to work with as it is. Give yourself some extra grace there. So once we have all of those in place, we can start actually assembling the glove into a glove shape. So those forks get stitched to the underside of the glove. This is definitely a fidgety process. It is not an easy one. And I can definitely see how it would be much easier on a proper gloving machine, but it still came out fairly well. I'm happy with it. This is the point where you can actually check to see if it fits your hand too, which is pretty exciting. And the final part is dealing with that bottom opening. You can leave it unfinished, you can do a lining to this, but instead I prefer to do a little binding. So I'm stitching a 2 centimeter wide strip of leather around, right side to right side, flipping it over, and then top stitching. I'm using the top stitch as a decorative method, but you can also very carefully whip stitch to the interior invisibly by hand.